Okay, so good morning everyone. I have the pleasure to introduce you to Martin Hilpert, who is professor of English linguistics at the University of Neuchâtel. And is an expert in construction grammar, on which he devoted a great number of works, including a textbook which is called Construction Grammar in English and its Applications. And he's also worked a lot on corpus linguistics and empirical approaches to the diachronic linguistics. And among other works, he also works on cognitive linguistics, and this will be related to this third line of research, I think. So, thanks to you.
Well, thanks for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. Je présente mes excuses, je vais vous parler en anglais, mais je réalise qu'en sciences dures, c'est plutôt normal, n'est-ce pas? Alors, yeah, so in this talk, I'll talk about asymmetric priming, which has been suggested as a force that shapes language change in the long run. So, before I say anything else, let me perhaps explain what asymmetric priming is. So, here's a little experiment that maybe you can do with your friends. So, if you ask people to think of 3 words that come to mind when you give them the word paddle, now you can make a little list of words that come to mind, maybe 3, maybe 5. And we could do this here, but in the interest of time, let me just tell you that many people will have water as one of their words in their lists. Yeah? So if you have 5, then maybe something like boat will come first, and then lake or river. Water is usually one of them. Okay, now imagine, what do you think people will write down when you give them this task in reverse? So here's a word, water. What are the first 5 words that come to mind when you hear water? And in that case, people offer things like rain or ocean or things like that, but paddle is probably way, way, way down on the list. Yeah? That's asymmetric priming. In a nutshell, one concept, idea, form, sound, whatever, strongly evoking a second one, but that second one only weakly, if at all, evoking the first one. Yeah? So there's this asymmetry in association strength, if you like. Okay, what am I going to do? Let me give you a brief overview. First, I will talk about what is known as the asymmetric priming hypothesis, and I'll present an experimental study that tests this hypothesis, its predictions, and I will then continue with a second study that tests the asymmetric priming hypothesis on the basis of corpus data, so large textual evidence, offline data, if you like, and then I'll end on some conclusions. All right, so what is this asymmetric priming hypothesis that I've been talking about? It goes back to a paper that is maybe a rare phenomenon in linguistics, people going out there and making a prediction about something that should be the case. Yeah? So Gerhard Jäger and Annette Rosenbach have done something like that. They have written a paper in which they make a claim about language change. And they say, we argue that the psycholinguistic mechanism of priming may account for the empirical observation that grammaticalization processes typically proceed in one direction only. All right, so grammaticalization, that's the emergence of grammatical markers such as tense markers, aspect markers, grammatical constructions like cleft sentences, relative clauses, all that kind of stuff. And in grammaticalization, there is the empirical tendency for things to develop unidirectionality, that is, in one direction only. And this concerns, well, one of the things this concerns is meaning. So meaning developments in grammaticalization tend to start with something concrete, something very specific, words that encode lexical meanings, and these lexical meanings tend to become more abstract and more schematic. All right, and now Jäger and Rosenbach want to tie this to priming. Yeah? And they say, very generally, the prediction is that in any reported case of change, where the development goes unidirectionally from A to B, A should prime B, but not vice versa. Okay, and when I read this, I was quite excited because I thought, well, this is something that you can actually go and test. This is something that is falsifiable. So let's take a concrete example to make these more, this idea more explicit. So imagine that you are out on a road and you meet a friend of yours. So the stick figure is your friend, who tells you, I'm going to the station. Yeah, Gare de Blythe, maybe. And so the asymmetric priming hypothesis will predict that even though your friend just talked about the act of walking, you'd be likely to think about your friend's future actions. So is he going to catch his train all right? What is he going to do once he gets where he wants to go? So just hearing about movement, I'm going to the station, should strongly prime the idea of future time. Okay, so let's imagine the converse scenario. You are maybe talking to a friend on the phone, and your friend is saying, oh, I gotta go, I'm going to miss my train. Yeah? So talking about time. Does this sentence activate the idea of movement to the same extent that the expression of movement primes the idea of time? The asymmetric priming hypothesis predicts that this only weakly activates an idea of movement. Yeah? So that there is this asymmetry between movement on the one hand and future time on the other. Yeah? So in a nutshell, when we have pairs of going to and going, the hypothesis predicts that lexical going should prime grammatical be going to, should facilitate processing the grammatical be going to. But inversely, grammatical be going to should not prime lexical going. Okay. So the research question that we set out to test then was this. Does go prime be going to, but not vice versa? Yeah, that's it in a nutshell. Of course, we did not just look at be going to, but we looked in fact at a whole range of different pairs of grammatical forms and their lexical counterparts. Right. So in order to find out whether something like this is actually going on, we designed an experimental study which was meant to assess whether the asymmetric priming hypothesis makes the right predictions in language processing in real-life speakers. All right, so what did we do? First thing we did is that we constructed a database of 20 elements that have both lexical uses and grammatical uses. So I've shown these here in red and blue. With an English verb like have has lexical uses. So it can indicate possession, as in have a problem. But it has also a grammatical function as auxiliary of the perfect, have solved the problem. Keep has some lexical uses where it means retain. Keep walking has acquired more of a grammatical aspectual function, meaning continue walking. And we find lots and lots of other examples where the same principle is at work. Yeah? So a word with primarily lexical, specific meaning, and a second variant of it that has grammaticalized and has a more abstract schematic meaning. Now, importantly, this is the case for almost any phenomenon of grammaticalization, that the original lexical source is still in the language, is still being used, but there's this new variant that has acquired a more schematic abstract meaning. All right, so that's what we created at first. And as a test of the asymmetric priming hypothesis, we wanted to find out whether between these items, between these pairs of items, the red and the blue, are there asymmetries in the ways lexical elements prime their grammaticalized counterparts and vice versa. Okay. For that, we needed an experimental paradigm that would allow us to investigate that kind of question. And something that we stumbled upon is a mixture of self-paced reading, which maybe you know, and a forced choice task. So because it's not so common as a paradigm, I brought you a little example. So the paradigm goes by the name of the maze task. And in the experiment, participants have two buttons, two response buttons, left and right. And they are given instructions like these ones here. in a moment you will see two words displayed on the screen. Your task is to select one of them, and the words that you select should combine to form a meaningful sentence of English. So let's have a concrete example of this. So this would be the first screen, and there you don't really have a choice. Yeah? So you have the and a non-competitor. On the next screen, again, two words. So the first one was the, so the second one would have to be cat, right? Is on the mat. Okay, that's it. That's how it works. For the study, we recruited 200 participants, native speakers of American English, via Amazon's Mechanical Turk platform. Every participant saw 40 stimuli sentences, half of which had some priming relation in it. We only analyzed fully correct responses. We removed outliers, and we measured reaction times in 4 conditions that I'm going to explain to you. All right, so in the first condition, we collected responses to a grammatical element, the end of the sentence, that had been primed by its lexical counterpart. So this is what we call the grammatical primed condition. Sentences like, the student kept the light on to keep reading. Yeah? So here we have lexical keep first, which, according to the asymmetric priming hypothesis, should yield a processing advantage for the participant once they get to grammatical keep. Yeah? Okay, grammatical prime. These sentences we contrasted to the second condition that we call grammatical unprimed. So also here we have grammatical keep in this final position in the sentence. But notice that in this condition, the first verb here is unrelated to keep. So that should not yield any advantage for processing grammatical keep here, yeah, in comparison to that. Now, in condition 3 and 4, we flip the order of lexical and grammatical. So here, in the third condition, we have grammatical keep first, and here we measure response times to the lexical variant of keep, which is primed. Yeah? And because the asymmetric priming hypothesis predicts that grammatical keep should only weakly, if at all, activate lexical keep, here we in fact hypothesize no difference whatsoever between the variant that has priming and the variant that has no priming. Yeah? So here we have lexical keep preceded by an unrelated verb that appears in the beginning of the sentence. Okay, so let me just summarize what I just said. So on the asymmetric priming hypothesis, keep in the first sentence should yield a processing advantage over keep in the second one because we have lexical keep priming grammatical keep. And a different prediction holds for the second pair of stimuli. Since grammatical keep is not expected to prime lexical keep, it should behave no differently from the other auxiliary verb, and so no difference in reaction time is expected here. Okay, so we obtained some 6,800 observations from our participants and modeled this with mixed effects regression design. The dependent variable was reaction time, logged and centered. Predictive variables were priming. Yeah? Do we have a priming relation between, say, lexical keep and grammatical keep? Is the thing that we're measuring grammatical, yes or no? So is it grammatical or lexical? We also accounted for the lemma frequency of the item. Yeah? So something like have is super frequent, something like keep, less so. And we have reasons to believe that priming is actually different, has effects of different magnitudes depending on the frequency of the item. Yeah? So low frequency items have much greater benefits from being primed than high frequency items. Something like have is so frequent you can easily activate it. Something like, say, used, from used to, is much less frequent, and therefore it benefits much more from being activated before. All right, we had some control variables just to make sure that these don't skew our results. Gender, age, handedness, left and right. And as random factors, we modeled different intercepts for participants and for items, that is our linguistic elements. We tested for an interaction term between priming and the grammatical variable, yes or no. And this is actually the asymmetric priming hypothesis. Yeah? So priming effect should be there, but only if the elements appear in a certain sequence. So priming should be contingent on this grammatical variable. And we also tested for an interaction between priming and frequency. Okay, so this is the full model. None of the control variables had any significant effect, so we could get rid of them. That's good news in principle. There was also no interaction between priming and frequency, so we could exclude that as well. And so the minimal model is what you see here. And I'm just going to walk you through the effects that we found very briefly. So first result, there is an effect of the priming variable. However, primed elements are actually slower. Yeah? So if our participants had seen keep before, the second time they were asked to process this, that came out a little slower than in the other condition. Yeah, so that was the first surprise. Second effect, grammatical elements were on average slower. Yeah? Also, this is not really in line with the asymmetric priming hypothesis, which expects you to have an advantage in grammatical items, especially when they've been primed. We have a borderline significant frequency effect that is trivial or at least non-surprising. So high frequency forms are processed faster than low frequency forms, which is what we would expect. Yeah? And then finally, we have an interaction between priming and the lexical versus grammatical variable. So this term tests the asymmetric priming hypothesis, as you will. And well, the good news is there is an effect. The slightly worrying news is it's in the other direction. Yeah? So responses to grammatical forms are slowed down, especially so when they've been primed by their lexical counterparts. Yeah? So it's the exact opposite of what the asymmetric priming hypothesis will predict. All right. So as you remember, we expected no difference between these two. We expected a difference between those two. And as far as the second pair of stimuli here, our hypothesis turned out to be correct. As far as the difference between grammatical primed and grammatical unprimed, the asymmetric priming hypothesis would predict an advantage of grammatical primed, and that was not found. In fact, we find the opposite. Here you see
the opposite could mean that you have a signal that you should pay attention to, and then it implies more processing.
Yes, it implies more processing. I'll give you our story, our explanation of what we think is going on. So we don't quite interpret it as a signal of, maybe a problem going on. Rather, it is what in the literature has been called a horror equi effect. So that people don't like to process the same thing with different meanings in a short sequence of time. Yeah. All right. Okay. Here, these are the reaction times. So no difference between the primed and unprimed lexical, and a difference between primed grammatical and unprimed grammatical. But really, what the asymmetric priming hypothesis would have predicted would be that this this box plot would be further down here, so significantly shorter latencies than in the unprimed grammatical condition. So it's robust. It corresponds exactly to pilot studies that we've been doing in the lab with real people. And yeah, there's really not much wiggle room to get out of this mess. So, does go prime be going to, but not vice versa? We do observe asymmetric priming effects, but not in the way we expected. So, priming between lexical forms and their grammaticalized counterparts is negative. It takes longer to process a given form when it has been primed. And this negative priming effect particularly affects the processing of grammatical elements. So, go slows down be going to more than vice versa. Right. So the experimental evidence then seems to contradict the asymmetric priming hypothesis, but before giving up on it, we wanted to consider another methodological perspective, namely a corpus-based approach. So we wanted to find out whether grammatical forms in corpus data are preceded by their lexical sources more often than we would expect, given a chance baseline. And as an extension of this, we wondered if we could use methods from distributional semantics to test the asymmetric priming hypothesis. And I'm not quite sure about this audience how much I have to say about distributional semantics. So what you're about to see is how I explain this to a linguistic audience. If this is too much kindergarten, please let me know.
We are not all linguists.
All right. So on this slide, you see different words that describe things that could be found on a farm. And in this sense, all of these words are semantically related. But of course, they're not all equally similar to each other. So if you were to give these words to a human observer and ask them to form categories, they'd probably come up with 3 different categories: animals, vegetables, and a bunch of clothing items. Yeah. So we can all agree that these clusters are more similar to themselves than all of the words are to each other. Yeah. So there are these categories in the set of farm words. And distributional semantics is just a way of having a computer do the same thing. So here you see essentially the same graph, except that this has been done just on the basis of co-occurrence frequencies in corpus data, where a computer essentially emulates human behavior, and even in ways that are surprisingly reassuring with regard to human categorization. So for instance, you notice that corn and wheat, which I had in my vegetable cluster, the computer judges these as not quite good vegetables. Yeah? And you can see why. That those, wheat is not the kind of thing that you put in your salad or your vegetable soup. Yeah? So it is a plant, yes, but it's different from potatoes, beans, and cabbage. Right? Okay, so just want to briefly go through the way this is done. So how does this automatic positioning in semantic space work? What work steps are involved? First thing that is done is that we choose a vocabulary of keywords and retrieve frequencies of context items from a corpus. So all of these farm words we can put, okay, I speak German, and so in German there's the word Wortschatz, which means vocabulary. I don't know if you know that. Anyway, that's how the treasure chest ends up here. That's the Wortschatz, the vocabulary. And once we have this kind of vocabulary, we can take out words from that vocabulary, research them in a corpus, retrieve what linguists call a concordance. Yeah? So here we have all the examples of the element goat taken from that corpus. And so we have what linguists call concordance lines. So keyword with a context to the left, and to the right. So this is the basis, the textual basis for everything that is to follow. And the first processing step usually is that grammatical elements and other high-frequency words are deleted from the context. Yeah? So pronouns like I or you, determinants like this, or grammatical elements like to, all of these are zapped from the concordance. So what's left is a context of highly specific lexical items that are predictive of the word goat. Okay, so these entire context words we can put into a bag of words. Again, that's a technical term in corpus linguistics. And this bag of words represents our goat context. Yeah? And rather conveniently, we can transform this bag of words into a frequency list of lexical elements that are typical in the context of goat. Yeah? So in this corpus that I took, goat co-occurs a lot with mountain. So apparently there are texts about mountain goats. Lexical elements occur frequently with themselves. That's not a bug, that's just how things are. And then we have things like cheese, meat, horns, yeah, so things that inform our idea or understanding of what a goat is and what it does and in what context we may be likely to find it. Okay, and of course we don't just do this for goat, we do this for all the vocabulary items that we have in our Wortschatz. And the reasoning would be that words that are semantically related, like goat and cow, have similar frequency lists. Yeah? And this we can anecdotally see here. So for cow, obviously milk is high up, yeah? And then goat has the same thing. And words that are semantically different or unrelated, so pig and trousers, I don't know. I mean, if you have pigs, then you probably also have a pair of trousers, but that's about, as tenuous a relation as you can have. So there should not be a whole lot of overlap in these lists. Yeah? So words with similar frequency lists at similar frequencies, they should have some kind of semantic relation. Either synonymy, that they mean the same thing or roughly the same thing. They could also be antonyms, meaning exact opposites, like hot and cold. Yeah? Or they could be co-hyponyms, so words that belong to the same category. Like rose and daisy, they're both flowers. Yeah? So we would expect them to co-occur with similar sets of vocabulary items. Right. So we've chosen a vocabulary of keywords. We've retrieved frequencies of context items from a corpus. And the next thing to be done is the construction of a table of frequencies with the vocabulary items in the columns and the context items in the rows. This can be the other way around, but you have to make a choice there. So this would be the vocabulary items, the context items, and then all the co-occurrence frequencies in the cells. And you notice that some cells are empty. Yeah? So pig does not co-occur with gray in the sample. Now these vectors are actually comparable mathematically. So you can look at the absolute differences between the co-occurrence frequencies of, say, goat and cow, and come up with some numerical value that approximates the semantic distance between the two. Basically, of course. So there's one rather important thing that I haven't mentioned, namely that these raw frequencies that we have in here need to be transformed with some collocation measure, as for example, mutual information. So why is that? Well, there's a problem when we're looking at low frequency items. So if you compare cow and pig with regard to their collocate gray, well, both of them have 0 for this particular context item. And this could be taken to mean that they're actually semantically similar, yeah? Because there's no difference. And so you can imagine if you have elements that are low frequency to begin with, you'll have vectors with lots and lots of zeros. Yeah? So if you compare two low frequency items, the algorithm will think that these are actually very similar, even though all that's similar across them might be just their low frequency. So the solution to this is a collocation measure that is sensitive to the overall frequencies of words. We've used pointwise mutual information for this. There are other methods available. So just to illustrate this a little bit, goat co-occurs 20 times with cheese. is this a lot? Is this a little? How do we know? Yeah. So pointwise mutual information uses the marginal frequencies of the collocates and of the vocabulary items. So on the whole, we have about 2,000 instances of goat, we have about 10,000 instances of cheese, and we have 20 co-occurrences of the two. On the whole, in this table, we have a large number of collocations because there are lots of vocabulary items, lots of context items. So based on these marginal frequencies, we can determine that there's actually quite a large asymmetry between 20 and 10,000 and 2,000 and 160 million. So goat cheese is vastly overrepresented, meaning that, well, this is a value then that we can exchange for these raw frequencies. Right. And this then brings us to the fourth and final step, visualization. So with the table that contains the values of pointwise mutual information rather than raw frequencies, we can create visualizations like this. And there are many methods available that can do this. We used multidimensional scaling. So how do we get back to asymmetric priming? We're almost there. But there's one more thing, one extension of the general technique that I need to mention. So we turned to what is called token-based semantic vector space modeling. In the graph you just saw, every element in the graph represents a word type. That is the word hat, which is here. Its position is determined by lots and lots of concordance lines that we retrieved from a corpus for this word. Yeah? So maybe the corpus that we used contained 500 actual lines with hat and their collocates. Yeah? So that is what determines this position in relation to the other words. Now, what we want to do is something slightly different. Yeah? So we would like to compare things like lexical going and grammatical be going too, which actually share the same form. And this, of course, means that we have a little problem. So the type-based approach that we have here is only of limited use. However, there's a solution, namely token-based vector spaces, which proceed in a very similar way, but they show semantic differences between word tokens of the same type. So in these kinds of semantic vector spaces, each keyword token is represented by one concordance line. Yeah? So we try to visualize a cloud of different uses of the same word. And you may wonder at this point, well, how can you do that? How can you make comparisons based on only a few context elements, like maybe 3 or 4 words to the left and to the right? Isn't that too little data to be able to say something meaningful about this? And you'd be right in asking this. And the answer is that we use collocates of collocates to enrich the semantic representations of our concordance lines. So collocates of collocates are sometimes also called second-order collocates. Let me explain how this works. So we basically need 2 things for token-based semantic vector spaces. And the first thing is a type-based semantic vector space of the kind that I showed you earlier, except this one has a much larger vocabulary. Yeah? So we created a type-based semantic vector space with 20,000 keywords. Yeah? So we took the most frequent elements from a large corpus of English, the British National Corpus. And as context items, we took those same 20,000 elements. Yeah? So we have a table that starts with words that begin early in the alphabet, above, alike, and so on and so forth. And we end somewhere 20,000 elements later. And the same holds for the context items that go all the way down. Right. So that's the first thing that we need. And since this table is the basis for the analysis is to follow, I'll refer to this as the mother table. Yeah? So it's the database that we have for the remaining analyses. The second thing that we need are concordance lines for a word that we'd like to model. Okay, so here we have a short concordance of the word since, And what we're trying to do now is to create a semantic vector space that shows similarities and differences across these concordance lines. Yeah? All right, how do we do that? So the first step is the same as in the type-based semantic vector spaces. We exclude all the stop words that are in there. And then we take the context items from the first concordance line. Yeah, so that is, we take advantage, we take drugs, we take toxic, and we take materials, and we put them into a little bag of words. Yeah, so that's our bag of words for concordance line 1, which at this point represents the meaning of that concordance line. Now, I said we were going to enrich the meaning by looking up second-order collocates. The way this is done is that we look up the context items, advantage, drugs, toxic, and materials from the big type-based vector space that we have. Okay? So in our bag of words, we only have 4 elements. But for these 4 elements, we have rich collocational information in the big type-based vector space that we created. Yeah? So we have now this table, and we can average across the 4 elements that are present in this concordance line. And as a result, we have a very, or a relatively rich representation, semantic representation of our first concordance line. And of course, we don't just do this for concordance line 1, we also do it for concordance line 2, for concordance line 3, for all the concordance lines that we would like to compare in terms of their meanings. Right. So we add up all our concordance lines and their vectors in a table like this. And with that kind of table, we can now, in principle, create a visualization of the kind that you've seen earlier, except this time the visualization represents all concordance lines of synths that we've retrieved from a corpus. So what this allows us to do, essentially, is to map out any differences in the symmetric spectrum of synths. And if you've looked at the examples here carefully, you may actually have noticed that there's a semantic difference between the second example and the first and the third example. So the second synth, since the change of government last weekend, expresses a temporal relation. Yeah, so this is about something that happened before last weekend and something that happened after last weekend. That's one meaning of English since. However, in the other 2 examples, since has a different meaning. There, it relates to a causal meaning. So since drugs are toxic materials, it's not as if drugs prior to some point in time had been perfectly healthy and now they're toxic. No, what the sentence says is that because drugs are toxic materials. Or the third line, since uranium reserves are finite, yeah, they have been finite all along. Yeah, no. So that's not a temporal meaning, but a causal meaning. And so our table is actually comprised of uses of synths that are temporal and uses of synths that are causal. And ideally, we would like to find some signature in the collocates for this semantic difference. Yeah? Okay. The semantic difference actually shows up in a visualization of a larger concordance of synths that we've retrieved. So in this graph, you see a token-based semantic vector space of several hundred concordance lines of synths. And while I'm ready to admit that there's no perfect separation of the 2 senses, well, there's actually some signature of meaning in this graph. So the red causal uses of synths cluster more towards the right side of the graph, and temporal synths are, they seem to be spread more or less all over the place. Yeah? Okay, so it's clear enough that there is some resonance of meaning in the collocational behavior of temporal and causal synths. And this observation finally brings us back to asymmetric priming, because So temporal sense and causal sense are related through grammaticalisation. So causal sense is what we could call a case of secondary grammaticalisation. There was the temporal meaning first, and then this sense gradually extended to the more abstract causal meaning of sense. Yeah? This happens across lots of languages. It's not something that linguists find very unusual. And this means, according to the asymmetric priming hypothesis, temporal sense should prime causal sense, but not vice versa. Yeah? Okay. Okay. Now, the examples that you've seen here and that we've been using actually come in pairs. Pairs like this one here. India's troubled relations with Sri Lanka have improved markedly since the change of government last weekend. Yeah, that's the example that you've seen. Then this goes on. The first foreign minister to visit Delhi since the general election. Yeah, so we have two instances of since in close proximity. We call this the prime, the first instance, and we call this the target, the second instance. And you notice that in this particular example, both the prime and the target have temporal meaning. Now, according to the asymmetric priming hypothesis, what we should see is that there should be a higher than chance ratio of examples that have temporal first and causal second. Yeah? And we wanted to know if that's actually borne out in the data. Yeah? Okay, so if two instances of sense follow one another, switches from temporal to causal should be more frequent than just chance. And secondly, relating to our distributional work, sequences that instantiate the same category, yeah? So even if we have just a sequence of temporal and temporal, or causal and causal, these within category switches should show a trajectory in semantic space in the direction of causal sense. I'll come back to this. So let me show you the graph again, and let me also show you the frequencies of sequences that we have in our data. Okay. So let's maybe look at the table first. In the table, we see all the pairs of senses that we have in our corpus data. And you see that switches from temporal to causal are actually underrepresented with regard to what we would expect. So this, again, is the opposite of what the asymmetric priming hypothesis will predict. Had we found something like 50 or 60, that would have exceeded our expected frequencies. Note also that the opposite, from causal to temporal, is underrepresented. Here we would have expected even more, so this discrepancy is even higher. However, look at the gray numbers. Those are the within category sequences. So from temporal to temporal, that's the most frequent case. From causal to causal, both of these are heavily overrepresented, meaning that we do see priming effects. Yeah? Those are priming effects. Causal sense primes the speaker to reuse causal sense further down the line. Temporal sense allows the speaker to use temporal sense again on a future occasion. However, these switches are much less frequent than we would expect. All right, now let's look at the arrows here. So what I said was, even if we have within category sequences, we would expect some kind of drift towards the causal end of the spectrum, yeah? Assuming that this would be some kind of attractor space for different meanings that you can express with sense. Now, here we have the black arrows that show switches from causal to temporal, so something that the asymmetric priming hypothesis would not predict. And here, the red ones are actually the cases from temporal to causal that the asymmetric priming hypothesis would predict. And you see that there's no real sense of clear direction or no tendency of direction. these arrows simply go all over the place. Yeah? So it's not like we have lots of arrows starting here, moving into the causal territory. It's rather that these arrows, they move all over the place, and there's no way of predicting how they are going to go. Okay. Right. Okay, so we've also checked for things like the length of all arrows, thinking that maybe switches from temporal to causal could on average be a little longer because causal meaning has this attraction, but there was really nothing there. All right, so the corpus-based example of since also seems to contradict the asymmetric priming hypothesis, which you could say is bad news for the hypothesis, but then again, since is maybe a weird example, right? It's a case of secondary grammaticalization, not primary grammaticalization, and it's only one example, so how much can you really conclude from that? Well, we looked at different pairs of grammatical elements and their lexical sources, including, for example, used, the element used, which occurs in a lexical sense. I used my key, or habitual, used to. I used to work in France. Yeah? So that is a distinction between different lexical and grammatical instances of use. And we find basically the same thing. Yeah? So we have a semantic vector space that differentiates with some success between lexical uses and habitual uses, which cluster this time at the left side of the graph. And when we look at the switches and we measure the direction and length of the arrows, we again find basically a spaghetti situation where there's no real tendency where these arrows are going. So here's another example. Lexical got, I got a new car, versus modal got to, I got to go now. Same result. We have a semantic space that discriminates reasonably well, but in terms of the switches from one to the other, we see within category priming effects, but no cross-category asymmetric priming. And finally, this is a graph that shows deontic may, so you may now kiss the bride, versus epistemic may, that may have been a mistake. And again, the situation is exactly the same. All right, so with that, I'd like to come to my conclusions. So the gist of the asymmetric priming hypothesis is that lexical going should prime grammatical be going to, whereas grammatical be going should not prime lexical going. What we found was slightly different, namely that lexical going slows down grammatical be going to, whereas grammatical be going to does not seem to do anything much to lexical going. Yeah. So there is an asymmetry, it's just not in the way that would have been predicted by the hypothesis. How can we explain this? So I already mentioned the term horoequi. Processing or producing the same form twice within the space of a few words is difficult and usually strongly avoided by speakers under natural conditions. Yeah? Consider two of the sentences that we tortured our participants with. So this was one of the actual stimulus sentences that people had to click through with distractors. The boys need new shoes that we need to buy. Yeah? And if you read this, I don't know, in a student essay or even in a local newspaper, you would go, where was the editor when we needed them most? Yeah, so this is not ungrammatical, but horrible. Now, compare this to this. You need to make a list of things you need. Not so terrible. Yeah? Of course, you've already been habituated a little bit by the first sentence. Yeah? So the more sentences I give you, your intuitions will wash out, within 5 or 10 sentences completely, so you won't even be able to tell that this is terrible. But the first time you saw it, you felt this gut reaction. Oh my God, that's terrible. This, if you see that for the first time, you don't find it so terrible. And that's because here the lexical thing comes first. Need to, modal comes second. So the sequence of lexical, grammatical elicits this gut reaction of, no. Here we have the grammatical need to first, and the lexical need second. And that doesn't seem to be so terrible. So there's this asymmetry, suggesting that horo-equi actually is not the same across the two sequences. And you might wonder, well, if horo-equi has a role to play, why is the effect asymmetric? Well, we've been thinking about this, and we think that semantic specificity may account for this. Across many cases of grammaticalization, we can actually observe a fading of horo-equi in forms that are strongly grammaticalized. So when you look at sentences like, my parents have had a dog, we have grammatical have, lexical have, completely adjacent, and nobody thinks it's terrible. It's completely normal. That's how it works. I'm going to go there. Again, going to, strongly grammaticalized, and lexical go and follow. That is perfectly fine. Here we have examples with, well, weakly grammaticalized elements. He used to use a typewriter. Yeah, I guess you can do that. It may come across as tongue-in-cheek. It happened to happen on a Tuesday. It definitely comes across as tongue-in-cheek. So I would probably discourage students from being too poetic in the term papers they hand in. So tone it down just a little bit. So I'm going to go there, no problem. So the more grammaticalized the form, the less the less horrible this co-occurrence. Right. What we found in the corpus-based analyses is that lexical forms prime themselves and grammatical forms prime themselves. So in these cases, there is no horo-equi, right? So processing the same thing with the same meaning twice is not a problem. Yeah, that's fine. It's just when you process the same form with different meanings that you get into these zeugmatic or horo-equi situations. Right, so in conclusion, both the experimental results and the corpus-based results detract from the asymmetric priming hypothesis. And rather importantly, this result does not call into question the power of priming as a force on language use. Yeah? So priming is definitely one major player when it comes to language processing. And our results also don't call into question that cognitive processes and cognitive biases that operate in real-life speech situations are in fact responsible for long-term change that we see in language and grammar. Our results do mean, however, that asymmetric priming is not the explanation behind unidirectionality in semantic change. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'd like to give a shout out to my doctoral student, David Correa Saavedra, who's been responsible for at least 50% of what you just heard. Thank you very much. Yeah.
So have you done experiments on this analysis of the horo-equi? So you show sentence and you ask for feelings?
There's a big literature that does this. And horo-equi you can actually also demonstrate neatly in offline data. So production data where you have spoken corpora that show that speakers tend to avoid that kind of thing. Yeah? You do see it verbalized even in things like style guides, which sometimes people obey, sometimes they don't. Yeah? But this kind of thing is something that is one of those rare cases where people's natural inclinations and the advice that you find in style guides actually coincide. Yeah, so one of those cases where style guides are actually not wrong, but are onto something that is useful and that makes processing easier rather than just being random.
had a small question. Wouldn't you think that it's not so much horror equi as the importance of one form, one meaning that it shows, that your data shows, that it's harder to admit that you're going to use the same form with a different meaning? I had the feeling that it's pointed towards something more like that. Or maybe not only, but also that.
Okay. I think one form, one meaning is especially important when the meaning of that form is very, very specific. Yeah. So a form such as have has many meanings, and nobody seems to be bothered by that too much because those meanings are abstract and schematic and relatively pliable. Yeah. So and maybe as a result of that, speakers don't invest a lot of processing effort in comprehending a form such as have. Yeah, it signals some kind of relation, but we're happy to postpone what exactly that relation is going to be. Yeah. Whereas if you have an item like avocado, that immediately triggers a very specific mental image and specific also formal syntactic representations. So it has to be a noun. You can modify it. That can be a determiner. Stuff like that. Yeah. So, yeah, those characteristics, of course, are consequences of grammaticalization. But, well, there's also lexical elements that are highly polysemous and highly abstract. So for them, I would actually assume that something similar could be observed. Don't have a good example right now.
At least as far as the form is concerned, in examples in which you have the grammatical version first, even though the written form is the same, it's actually, it might even be processed in a different way. When you say I have had or I have got, you say I've got and I've had.
In speech, yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, and probably even, I mean, in processing, I would imagine that it's not processed exactly the same way.
Yeah.
I'm going to, I'm gonna, things like that.
Yeah, well, of course. So this is due to the artificial nature of our experimental design. When you construct a sentence and the first element is I and the second element is have, at that moment you don't know whether you are dealing with grammatical or lexical have. That gets disambiguated a split second later. And so at that point you can free up resources and forget anything that you would have done with lexical have, if it turns out to be grammatical. But while you're processing that, it's still ambiguous.
I mean, of course, it's hard to know exactly what goes on inside the mind of the participants when they do it. But still.
Yeah, I mean, all we have is the latencies, so that we know when, at what point speakers are maybe confused or confident, and also any confusion that shows up may actually show up a little later than the actual word that causes the confusion. So there are these spillover effects that latencies get longer now, a little while later than the problematic stimulus. Yeah, but that's all we have.
So in the plot that you show, you project in 2 dimensions because it is convenient, but did you look with a third dimension?
No, we did not. I mean, that will be easy to do here. It's really mainly for presentation purposes that we use this 2-dimensional format. Generally speaking, 2 dimensions here are good enough in the sense that both axes, if you use the axes as predictors to have a rough classification, they come out as significant, and if you add a third one, it comes out as significant too, but it doesn't add much to the overall classification accuracy. So, generally speaking, these vector spaces don't perform very, very accurate in terms of explaining all of the variance there is, but that's also nothing that I personally would expect
But even for the direction, when you plot the arrows, it could be that there are actually some structure in the sound dimension.
Yeah, yeah. So for that, I'd be really happy to talk to someone who can, who has a better understanding of multidimensional spaces than I do. So probably I'm in the right place for that.
I still have questions.
Yeah.
About the semantic maps.
Yeah.
You seem to be a bit disappointed that there's so much overlap between the non-grammatical and grammatical versions. I was wondering if, in a diachronic view of these maps, you'd find something that's a bit clearer or not. Did you try that?
It's on my list. It's on my list to do all of this diachronically because the data is there. At this point, it's mainly the computational effort that keeps me from doing it, and also when you're comparing different time slices, a conceptual question is, what is your frame of reference? So do you perform separate analyses for every slice of time that you have? And if you do that, how do you make sure that you don't get completely different distributions each time around? If you decide to do like one big analysis on the entire diachronic corpus to have a common frame of reference, then there are other conceptual consequences following from this, meaning that you're assuming some kind of super mind who sees language in eternity and can perceive how language has changed over time. I've played around with both variants, but I haven't been able to fully work out the conceptual consequences of the decisions that you make early on in that process, and that's why I've been shying away from that.
Could you have some kind of like partial overlap, like a speaker who even though you don't necessarily master exactly the language at your birth and until you die, but still you speak at different time periods, and the language does change a little bit. So you could imagine like, I don't know, 50 or 70 year periods that overlap. I don't know if that's feasible, but something like that would seem reasonable.
Yeah. So something diachronic that I have done, I've done in such a way that I took, that I took present day data to create the frame of reference, and then I used frequencies from diachronic corpora to show where the semantic space that we have today gets populated earlier and later. I'm happy to show you that later today. So that makes the assumption that words don't change meaning over time, which clearly isn't the case, but it is one approximation that you can make. I'm still thinking about how to bring diachrony and synchrony together in useful ways with this kind of design.
Oh, it is complicated.
Other questions? Okay, so thank you again.
Thanks for having me.
Second seminar of today, we have Richard Blythe, who is from physics this time, and we will talk about evolutionary forces in language change, and he's in particular one of the authors of this very nice paper about model of evolution that Quentin mentioned yesterday for those who were at the PhD defense. And so I guess you will present new results on the topic. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So thank you everyone for coming along. It's an absolute pleasure to be in Paris and to have the opportunity to speak to you. And so I'm trying to remember to stay in shot. And hello if you're watching at the end of the internet, nice to see you. Right, so very kind of generic title, Evolutionary Forces in Language Change. I'll sort of try and explain what that means. There are connections to the previous talk. at some level, I guess. It'd be interesting to sort of try and flesh out more what they are. So as a physicist, I am interested in the connection between things that happen at the level of individuals and how that relates to populations. So in the subject area that I come from, statistical physics, that's what we do with fluids and gases and solids and stuff like that. We start at the level of atoms and try and understand, say, material properties. But why stop at dead and boring things like lumps of wood? Let's talk about people and languages and all the kind of exciting sort of cultural things that go on in our lives. And we can use many of the same methods to try and understand these things. So that's kind of why physicists have ended up getting into this game. But evolution is also important. So I tend to view the process of language change as a cultural evolutionary process, and it also turns out we can steal a lot of ideas from evolutionary biology. So it's kind of a confluence of physics, biology, and linguistics, and all sorts of other things. So in most talks about language that have the word evolution in the title, then most people show a picture of this gentleman here. He didn't always have a beard, by the way. And then there's this quote about Darwin basically taking the idea that language change is a gradual process and things get replicated and inherited from one speaker to the next is essentially uncontroversial. And then, of course, there's the process of biological evolution, which is sort of the new idea and might happen by a very similar process. Okay? And he says lots of interesting things. The bits that don't get quoted are the bits that are a bit kind of wacky and ridiculous and generally not believed these days. But most of what's said here is quite sensible. And let's just actually go right to the bottom of this. So we see variability, and new words are continually cropping up, but there's a limit to the power of memory, and single words like whole languages gradually become extinct. And I think that's quite a nice thing, because there he's drawing a parallel ways. He's mentioning quite a lot of things there. One is like individual people and what's going on inside their heads, the memory, the cognition, and all that kind of stuff. He's talking about individual components of the language, single words, but he's also talking about the language as a macroscopic kind of thing. So we've got sort of a whole bunch of different scales going on there, and the process of the individual being connected to the population. So that's kind of what I'm interested in. I should also show you an example of what I consider to be a prototypical language change, and it's this sort of thing. So this is Jack Chambers. It's the title of the paper is something like Canadian Furniture Items. I think this is my favourite bit of sociolinguistics because it's different words for a sofa, a settee, a couch. I don't know what it is in French actually. Just a comfortable. Sorry.
Canopy.
Oh, there we go. Some sort of comfortable long thing. Yeah, one of those actually. Okay. And if you're old and Canadian, so this is the age of the speaker. Okay, it's going this way. So in sociolinguistics, this is the apparent time construction, where you use the age of the speaker as a proxy for language behaviour at some time in the past. Then you follow this one. You were saying Chesterfield. Okay, so Chesterfield is a very old kind of English word for one of these furniture items. And then over time, couch has come in and replaced Chesterfield as the word of choice. I'm actually a sofa man myself, okay, but my son is a couch, so God knows how that happened, but there we go. And as Quentin told us about yesterday, he talked to us about S-curves, so this is your prototypical S-shaped curve of adoption, and this frequency here is, if we just look at these 5 different terms, what fraction of those instances were these different items used. Okay, so what we see here is the replacement of one form by another with a fixed meaning. And I was just sort of discussing just now that we've been trying to use some of the distributional semantics stuff that Martin talked about to find more examples of these things, and it turns out they're incredibly difficult to find in the history. And who knows, maybe the sociolinguists have cherry-picked the half a dozen examples where it's nice and clean and works like this, or maybe we're missing something really obvious. Okay, so some interesting questions about how commonplace this sort of scenario is. And yesterday the S-curves that you were talking about were slightly different. Okay, they were more about sort of expanding into a new sort of semantic space. Okay, so but this is the kind of process that I'll be focusing on in this talk, but we should caveat that with the fact that it may be less generic than we might hope for. Okay. So, evolution was in the title. So, so Darwin had these sort of ideas about kind of processes of gradual change. Obviously, things have happened since then, and we have sort of a clearer picture of how evolution works. And you can actually there is a framework in which you can talk about biological evolution and cultural evolution in sort of in a unified way, which has been introduced by David Hull and built on by Bill Croft, who's a linguist. So I'll run through the sort of the biological example first and just introduce the terminology, and then we'll find that we've got the same components in language, but they kind of glue together in a slightly different way. And that slight rearrangement turns out to be quite important. So the item that's at the centre of the heart of the evolutionary theory is a thing called a replicator, because evolution is a theory of change by replication. So in order to have changes through replication, you have to have something that you can replicate. Okay, and in biology, it's the gene. Okay, so there's my cartoon of a gene, and you might look at some part of a gene, and it's replicated over time, and it might stay the same, or it might change through the mutation process. Okay, so that's sort of a physicist interpretation of trivialization of biology. I hope there's no biologists in the audience who are now going to lynch me. Okay, so you can have replication, you can have variation, and if you don't have both of these things, then you can't have evolution, because you need to be able to generate new things. Okay, but you also need to be able to copy old things. Okay. Now, in biology, of course, so that's what's going on at the genotype level, but you also have a phenotype. Okay, so you know, this gene could be sitting inside this organism here, and in the language of these things, that sort of phenotype is called the interactor. So the interactor is a thing that is carrying these genes around and is the agent of a process called selection. And the point is that different genotypes could give you different phenotypes. Okay, so this is supposed to be a faster mouse, like a mouse with go faster stripes. Sorry, my artistry is not very good. You'll quickly discover through this talk I have absolutely no talent whatsoever.
It's a myopic mouse.
Yeah. And so these are the interactors. So these are the things that a process called selection works on. So selection allows some of the replicators to be replicated more frequently than other, and that vehicle for that is the interactor. So let me give you an example of how this works. So suppose you lived in an old flat, in an old apartment in Edinburgh, where this is kind of like an indigenous species. You can try all the different methods to get rid of them, but only one of them works, and it's one of these. So you install one of those, and it's able to catch these but not those, because those run faster, which then means that these genes get replicated faster because of this external agent of the selection that's going on here. Okay, so there we go. So that's biology in a nutshell. How does it work in a cultural context? Well, basically the same way, except that, like I say, same components, but they glue together slightly differently. So here's an example of a lexical item. It's what actually people don't call one of these things anymore. Okay, in the UK, a mobile phone. So you could call it a mobile, or you could call it a phone. Okay, so there we've got replication. If you just say the mobile phone, that's some variation coming here. Why might you vary? Why might you do this? Before, well, because actually landline phones don't really exist anymore. So we've got the word phone lying around that we could use instead, and it actually just as well describes this thing as that thing did. Okay, and so that's our replicator in Croft's theory is the linguistic utterance, and it can be replicated perfectly, which we need to do most of the time, because otherwise, you know, language is a system of conventions. If we completely invented new words every time we spoke, we wouldn't ever be able to communicate. So some degree of replication is important, but there are many ways in which variation can enter the language. Okay. So what's the interactor? The interactor is a language user. Here's one, and a very, very loud one. And the interactor basically gets to choose which words get used. So the interactor is the agent of selection. So the interactors are the ones applying the selective force, and they may have their own reasons for not saying mobile, and they can come from lots of different places, like social motivations, that, you know, the people who I like say phone and not mobile, or there could be other reasons, like maybe it's easier to say, maybe it's more expressive in some ways. There's a whole bunch of different ways in which you might, given that this variation exists, that you might then reproduce more quickly one form than another. Okay, so that's how these things glue together. But the important difference here between the two, and what's going to be relevant for this talk, is that the genes are embedded in the organisms. There's quite a tight linkage between the two. Here, the words, or the linguines, as Bill calls them, and the interactor, they're much more separated, and so there are processes of selection which can actually operate on interactors. You might just prefer talking to some people more than others, or they could work on the linguistic items as well. So there's sort of two places where selection can operate, and this will lead to some slightly more fine-grained characterization of selection than maybe you get elsewhere. Okay, and that turns out to be completely true. So you can go into the literature and look at the various ways that people talk about different linguistic variants being replicated for different reasons, and you can find actually these two distinct types of selection. So one of them we call replicator selection. So replicator, remember, is basically the word, if you're a non-linguist, or one of the many words that linguists have for words if you are a linguist. And this one we ascribed to Sturtevant, who talked about this idea of that the way of speaking is associated with a particular social group, and that gives you a reason to preferentially emulate that way of speaking in another. Okay, and we call that replicator selection. Why? Because it's the word somehow has this prestige attached to it, and that is a reason for using it more often. So it's the form itself, which is the thing that carries this idea of, like, I want to be said more often, or people want to say me more often. Okay, so that we call replicator selection. But there's another thing that can be done, which is often ascribed to Bloomfield, which is the idea of a principle of density. And this is a bit more subtle. What this is saying is that, well, it is just a fact that I talk to some people more often than others. Okay? And therefore it's unsurprising that I should just sound like the people that I talk to more often than others. And it's not that what they're saying is important, it's just the fact that because I encounter these people more often, I say what they say more often, and that's why I end up doing more of this thing and less of that thing. So it's a more sort of a passive effect. So it's completely independent of what the, whether it was like mobile or phone. Okay. In this one it would be, we just prefer phone because it's shorter, it's like one syllable rather than two, and it's attached to the replicator, or it's just like all the posh people say phone, so I want to do that as well. Here it's just more like, I live in this village and people say phone. Okay. And so these are actually two distinct forms of selection, and it turns out that at the macroscopic scale, the types of language change that they predict are different. Okay, so that's where we are. So to flesh out that last statement, we have used a model. So this is the model that was talked about a little bit yesterday. So let me explain to you how it works. So we called it the utterance selection model. So here is a sort of a schematic of some kind of speech community. Each one of these blobs here is supposed to, one of these kind of fuzzy blobs, is supposed to represent a speaker. And in particular, the two different colours relate to some memory of these two variants. So say the sort of blue colour here was uses of mobile, and the sort of mustard coloured here was uses of phone. Then this person would have in their memory more instances of mobile, and this person would have more instances of phone. And the idea is that, if you were a sociolinguist and you're talking to these people, you would measure their token frequencies, and you'd see a lot of mobiles coming from this person, a lot of phones coming from that person. But the idea is that this is what's here is based on their linguistic experience. Okay, and how is that linguistic experience arrived at? It's a very, very, very simple model. The way that it works is that so we always in physics describe things in terms of the update rule. So this is what the update rule is. So the way that it works is that you pick one of the speakers on your social network. You pick somebody for them to talk to. Okay, that's what the lines between the note is supposed to indicate. And then we have a rule for producing an utterance, and the utterance, it's very simple. We just say, we go into our bag of memories, we just pick one out, like pick out a ball, and if it's blue, we just say mobile, and if it's yellow, we say phone. Okay, it really couldn't be any simpler than that. And then, of course, people have built in extensions that kind of incorporate various biases. And then what do we do? Well, once that's done, then the listener will make a change to their store. And again, we do that in the simplest possible way. We just say, well, let's just take one of these and replace one of one of the memories that was there before. Okay. So there is, of course, absolutely no psychological basis for this model whatsoever, but nevertheless, it's a kind of a useful working model. And one of the things that I would actually like to do is maybe, if far in the future, is to try and sort of, get some more detailed understanding of how people's memories actually work when it comes to language processing and stuff, and come up with something better than this. But this already does actually quite a lot of stuff, as we will see. Okay. One of the useful things is that actually this model, we weren't the first writers. We were really kind of pleased with ourselves and wrote it down. It's, oh, great, we've got this wonderful model and we can spend the rest of our lives studying it. Unfortunately, some people got there before us in the 1930s. So these are like really, really famous mathematical population geneticists who, they really did kind of pioneer a whole field. So what that actually means is that, oh great, there's lots of results that are known for these models and we can just adopt them and try and apply them to language and see what they tell us. Okay, so if you know about these things, what we've actually got here is something like a Wright-Fisher model in a subdivided population. So each one of these is a population of 2 alleles of a gene, a well-mixed population sitting on an island, and then you have migration flow between islands. Okay, if you know about these models. So great. So we have these 2 forms of selection. So how do we implement this in the model? It turns out actually quite straightforwardly. So one of them was the idea of interactor selection. So this is the idea that you might give more or less weight to speakers depending on who they are in the interactions, and we can implement that actually very easily. And it's in some sense sort of a social version of the asymmetry that Martin just talked about. So what that means is that this person could influence that one much more than this person. So one could be an old person, one could be a young person, for example, and so you might find that the effects that they have on each other are not symmetric. Okay, so we can implement that by just basically saying that the probability that something ends up going from the mouth of this person into the brain of that person is much higher than going the other way, and that's this kind of mathematical implementation of this idea of interactor selection. The replicator selection was the one that said that for whatever reason one of the variants is better than the other one, and again that's fairly easy to do. We just kind of increase the weight of one of them relative to the others. So when this person is sampling, instead of doing it uniformly, they might actually choose the blue one systematically slightly more than the yellow one because it's shorter or because it's associated with a speaker they want to be identified with, or whatever motivation you want to put in there. Okay. So mathematically, these 2 forms of selection end up going into the model in different ways. One is in biasing the original sampling process, and then the other one is in the process of transferring, of moving these kind of usages around from one speaker to another. Okay, good. So that's the model. So now talk. Yeah.
So when you speak,
yeah,
you keep the word in your.
Yeah.
What you mean by replacement is kind of a duplication.
Yeah. So we assume that the number of memories, if you like, is fixed for each individual. So if you do choose to store an instance of mobile in your memory, then you kind of have to get rid of something, you have to replace something there. Now, of course, this may be an artificial assumption. I mean, it's equivalent to having like an exponentially decaying kind of memory of previous usages. So you can set it up in a slightly different way, where you say, it goes into your head and it has some mean lifetime, and the probability that that memory is still there after that time sort of decays exponentially. There's various different ways.
And it's the same for both the speaker and the listener.
Yeah. So basically, I mean, you can formulate this in a wide variety of different ways. So you can have, for example, I've set it up in a way where you have a nominated speaker and a listener. In fact, our original version, we had them both talking to each other and both of them updating. It's exactly the same except for a factor of 2. Okay. So there's a whole wide space of models, all of which behave basically the same way. And actually, that's understood from from all of this work that if we think about the history of usages, you get these genealogical trees. So if there's 2 uses of phone, you can trace them back to a common ancestor, and that process is basically universal to a whole wide range of different models. So you can write down things which look a bit like this, and they'll just behave the same way. Okay, good, excellent. Right, so that actually segues quite nicely into the next bit. So Darwin identified that there were these kind of curious, well, people often quote him as curious parallels. He never actually said that. The word curious appears in the main text and parallel in a footnote, but it is a nice kind of pair of words to put together. One of these is that what we've been finding when we've been applying this sort of model to language change processes is that we're actually discovering a lot of the same things that population biologists sort of found about biological evolution, which may be a bit surprising because there's no reason that they should be the same. So the first is what I refer to as neutral drift being a mechanism that won't go away. So I'm going to expand on this over about the next 4 or 5 slides. So neutral drift is the process that I just described where you have no selection at all. So all you're doing is you're saying, I've got this memory sitting in my head, I just probabilistic reproduce, say 20%, 80% these things, and then we just update a little bit in response to what each person does, and there's no bias towards one of the variants. The speakers are all considered to be equivalent, and so on and so forth. And you might think that is a really boring model, but actually it does a lot of really interesting things. And in fact, it turns out to be an incredibly difficult hypothesis to reject, actually, as a mechanism for change. So let me take you through this. So the basic ingredients in this is that you have a random sampling process. So random sampling can be just, the biological context, it's kind of random reproduction of the individuals. In the linguistic context, it's just all I do is I probability match. I just say, in proportion to the probability that's in my head, these different linguistic forms. And we have to put some mutation. We have to put in some sort of variation, okay? Because it really is boring if you don't have any mutation, because everything, you would just end up with one word for everything, okay? So you have to have some mutation process. But if you have these two things, then you generate some actually quite complex patterns. So here's some genetic data. So we're in biology here. It's some human gene data. Basically what you do is you go in the lab and you just say, okay, I can see that there are these different variants of the gene, different alleles, and for each one I can just count how many of them there are, how many in this population, how many times did I get sort of gene type A, gene type B, gene type C, and so on. And you can do a histogram, and you find, for example, here that one of them, is very highly represented, and then there's quite a lot of mutations which are quite rare. So you get this sort of distribution of different genes. And there's one parameter in this model, which is the mutation rate, and you can just vary that, and you can get a prediction for what you expect to see from this drift model, and you find that these things match within confidence limits. Okay, so this mutation and sampling process can generate quite skewed distributions of types. Okay, so that's one of the things that happens. It happens with baby names as well. Where is that gone? There we go. Happens with baby names as well. So it's basically the same graph. So you have a small number of very common names and a large number of quite rare names. Okay, and again, you can get this, I think, with a fairly similar value of the mutation rate. And you can get a turnover of types. So here's a graph that's supposed to show that. So if you just put these two things together, what you find is so this is the frequency of one of the items. So I've just got two items here and we mutate between them. But you have kind of periods where one of them dominates, and then suddenly there's a shift to a period where the other one dominates, and so on and so forth. Now, it's quite noisy, okay, but nevertheless, this process can give you wide distribution of different, a skewed distribution of different types, and it can give you turnover, change in types, with absolutely no selection going on at all. Okay, so this kind of and so what people have found is through things like this that it's actually quite hard then to disprove the drift hypothesis, because you can actually find that it well describes quite a lot of data. However, over the years,
it's independent of the fact that, let's say, the size of the population is growing.
Yeah, right. So if you have a growing population, you end up with, so that case you can work with mathematically, and I think if you replace the population size with its harmonic mean, then basically you just end up doing a rescaling of time in it, and you get the same predictions. I mean, these are sort of, if you like, a kind of a steady state prediction. And I think that's right, yeah. So I think a lot of these things are actually, if you just have drift, when you put other processes in, then change in population size matters, but if you just have drift, then you can scale it out, basically. Okay.
Because the comment I had in mind when you were showing the first picture is that, I don't really know about the field, but it seems to me that the number of words,
Mm-hmm.
at least at some period of time in history, was increasing in the
Yeah.
vocabulary,
Okay.
whereas the number of types of mouse, okay, you might
Yeah,
have
yeah.
a steady state with one point, so to say.
So this actually comes back to the point I was making about we're living in this world where we have, say, multiple alternate forms with the same meaning, which may actually be quite a rare thing linguistically. So yeah, I mean, if you have technology, like new things in the world to talk about, and then you need to kind of make up new words in order to be able to do that. Or if you go back to very early societies, I guess, when look, we've got this whole world to talk about which no one's ever talked about before, then I guess you would have different dynamics. Yeah. Okay. Good. Anyway, so this coming back to the drift story. So it's quite hard to get away from. So again, here's some biological data. So you can do some more sort of sophisticated analysis, and you can show that actually, this is for some fruit flies. You just kind of get the histogram of how likely it is that two of these fruit flies have the same genes, and you can plot the histogram, and you can find out, well, where we are is in this tail of the histogram, so we can reject, for example, the null hypothesis of drift. In that case, I actually had to go at some of the baby name data myself, just to sort of see, what happened. So I essentially tried to apply the same method that was used for the human gene data to get the histogram. And actually, it's quite confusing because it really just depends on how much of the data you include in your sample. Okay, so I found that I could get it to work if I chose a week's worth of Scottish babies, but a year's worth I couldn't get it to fit. And what this is telling us here is actually these methods, what they're designed to do is they're designed to deal with samples, all of which are taken at the same moment in time. Okay, so when you actually integrate together multiple time points, then the methods, well, dealing with diachronic data actually turns out to be a lot harder mathematically than dealing with synchronic data. And we don't actually have good methods for dealing with it. And what this shows is that you have to sort of come up with those methods for dealing with diachronic data. Another thing is, so this is referred to yesterday, is that a few years ago we looked at the formation of New Zealand English language dialect with this model of drift, and we found that, yeah, you could get it to work, but you would have to have the speaker's entire memory of linguistic behaviour to be refreshed on about a 2-day timescale to get it to work, which we naively thought was unrealistically fast, but now I've started to learn more about priming and the timescales that priming operates on, and we might need a better model of memory actually to sort of try and understand how to interpret this. So I'll park that for a moment. But I think the reason why we can actually discard drift in a linguistic setting is if we come back to this type of replacement plot. And it came up yesterday. So the remarkable thing about an S-curve is how smooth it is. Okay, and there are examples actually you can find that span 400 or 500 years of a nice smooth. Like you keep measuring this thing, and you find that there's very little noise about this. You can put this interpolating logistic through these data, and there's hardly any noise on it. If you run drift, this is what you see. Okay, like massive amount of noise. Okay, and even if you just condition on the ones which happen to look a bit S-like, these things fluctuate wildly all over the place. Now, it may be that linguistically we don't have the time resolution to see those fluctuations, but it is remarkable that in all of these studies you see a really smooth, orderly change from one form to the other, sometimes over many centuries, and this kind of simple, kind of random process gives you something that has a lot more fluctuations on it. Now again, the mathematics of this curve are not quite well understood enough to be able to quantify the expected fluctuations that we should see on these things, but visually they look far too big. Okay, so we have reasons for some doubts. Except, okay, so this is some very recent work. I haven't actually seen it, so it appeared on a preprint archive. I haven't seen it in a journal yet, which is a shame because I think it's a really nice piece of work. So this is a study of Coho, looking at verb regularization or irregularizations. So basically, it's a case where you might think, so for each function, you have a choice of 2 forms. One is the regular form and one is the irregular form. And you can just do this, what percentage of them are regular or irregular over time, and plot them. And you can take this drift process. It's got a, we know a lot about the statistics of it. So you can basically ask the question, let's assume that it's just drifting as our sort of null hypothesis, and then ask, is a particular trajectory consistent or not consistent with that null hypothesis. Okay, so let's see some examples here. So what these people tell us is that there are examples, which are these ones here, where the verbs appear to be regularizing, and that's incompatible with the drift explanation. So there's the inference then is that there is some selection happening, possibly a replicator type selection going on these set of verbs. There are also some which are irregularizing. Okay, so some become more regular and some become less regular over time. And then all the ones in grey, which is actually most of them, are consistent with the drift hypothesis. Okay. So I'm not exactly sure what to make of this. I think what it might be saying is that where there is selection, it is sufficiently, its strength is sufficiently low that, and here we can see sort of some fairly big fluctuations even on the ones that are regularizing or irregularizing. That maybe maybe drift is actually not a bad starting point for most words. That there are a few of them which appear not to be drifting. I'm not sure, but I just thought I'd put that out there. But one thing that we do take away from this is that having time is interesting and useful. Okay, so like I said, a lot of the biology methods are based on the idea that you would go out and you would sequence the DNA of some mice that are living right now, and what you do with that is you reconstruct the history of that sample. Where in linguistics, I think we're a little bit lucky because we have records of what people were doing at time points in the past. Now, of course, these records get sparser and as you go further back in time and all the rest of it, but at least we do have those records. And so we can actually create plots like this that have temporal information embedded in them. And so there's a lot more information there. So we can see the process unfolding over time. We don't have to infer it. And so that does give us more statistical power. But unfortunately, the methods are lagging a little bit. We haven't quite yet got some good methods. And what you'll find is that I think everybody who works with data, I think, has always said, to be really sure about this conclusion, I need a factor of 2 more data. This seems to be particularly true of historical language data, that you can start to eke out some signals, but it's quite hard to actually get a strong signal. And that could be another reason why these kind of very simple random processes seem to work as a fairly good model. Okay. So, in the last part of this talk, I'm going to now describe our attempt to try and assign some kind of evolutionary explanation, or to try and quantify how much of the different evolutionary forces, whether drift or selection of different types, is going on, and trying to look at a much longer time depth. And here we do get maybe a little bit of a connection to the previous talk. So the example that we've been using is a grammaticalisation cycle that applies to indefinite and definite articles. Okay. So again, this may be like the kindergarten linguistics. Please don't shoot me. Okay. So here we go. So we've got, this is work that's under review. I'm expecting the rejection letter any time this week. Here we go. So for both indefinite and definite articles, it turns out there are basically 4 patterns that you can find in the world's language. If you go into something like the Wallace database, it tells you that there are these 4 patterns. And they are that there is no article, that you borrow a word, either the demonstrative for the definite article or the word for 1, the numeral 1, for the indefinite article. You have a distinct word that only has the article function, like the, okay, or you put an affix on the noun. Okay, so these are the 4 states that were tested. And historically, what happens is that they go through in this order. Okay, and the really cool thing is that when you get to the end, it goes back to the beginning. Okay, this is what I've been told. Now, a real linguist will go, no, it doesn't do that at all. But what Bill Croft has actually put together, looked at lots of different examples, and we have seen an example of each of these transitions that's shown here. And we basically, I think we only found 1 case ever of a reverse transition. Okay, so it seems to be something that's quite systematic, that the languages go through this sequence. Okay, and here's a sort of a cartoon of the languages. So Bill went into his library looked up about 80 books and managed to piece together 52 languages some sense of what's happened in history. So what this shows is the time period. So this is BC, this is AD. So there is no year zero, of course, but numerically we just invent one because it makes the maths easier. And the colours sort of show that what we know. So in most cases, what we know is we know the starting point, we know the ending point. We usually have an observation of the intermediate points, but we don't know exactly when the change happened. So in this data set, what we're saying is that, say, going from about minus 500 to the present day, this language went through four states, starting at the yellow one and ending in the white one. Okay, and they come from different parts of the world. So we've got European languages are kind of up here, and we've got various kind of South American languages, and we've got Chinese and Asian languages, and all sorts in there. And some of them are ancestors of others, so we kind of pull those out. So this is like the ancestor of two daughter languages, and we just treat those separately. Okay, it's the sort of dumbest way of doing this sort of thing. So there we go. So we have a data set to play with, and I believe looking at this kind of thing is referred to as the digital humanities, but I think normally you have a much bigger data set to work with than the one that we're doing. So this is quite small data, but nevertheless, actually, what we find is that this is enough to distinguish some hypotheses, which I think is quite encouraging, actually, because we only have about 50 languages. We don't have a lot of records. We can go back, say, 200-300 years with some of them, but we can nevertheless still extract some signal out of this. So I'm going to take you through that. So the simplest model of this process, let's just ignore the underlying speakers for the minute and just say what we've got here is we have a process where a language, the entire language can exist in one of these four states, okay, and it makes a change from one state to another over time. And if you do things like phylogenetic reconstructions, this is the kind of model that you actually assume. You say we can exist in state 1, and then there's some rate at which we can go into state 2. Okay? And there's no reference at all to the underlying population of speakers in this. We'll put that in a minute. So I refer to this as a non-evolutionary model. All we're just saying is that there is some process by which a language macroscopically at the population level can change from one state to another. Okay? And the simplest model of that is something called a Poisson process, which just means that at any point in time, the rate at which it changes from one state to the next is constant. But we make a slight tweak to this because what you observe cross-linguistically is some of these states are more probable than others. So we vary the rate according to how frequently observed it is, so that more commonly observed languages are stable for longer. Okay, but that's the only difference between that and the normal Poisson process. So what we're saying is, so Poisson process basically don't know, if I just take some little segment of time delta t, then the probability that the change happens in that little segment is this omega I times delta t, and I is which state of the language you're in. So if it's a more stable state, it will change more slowly, but that's it. Okay, there's the formula for omega I. There are only about 4 equations in this talk for people who don't like equations, so don't panic. Okay. But here's how we put in. So Fi is the fraction of languages in WALS that is in state I, and so if a large fraction of them are in a state, then the change rate is slower. Okay. We put that in, and just try that as a model. So what we can do with our data set is we can just go, so there's a free parameter in here, which is the mean rate of change, which is this omega. So I can just ask how likely was this data set for all possible choices of this omega, choose the one that maximizes that likelihood, and then apply some sort of goodness of fit test to say, does that provide a good description of the history or not? So here's some numbers, here's what you get. Let's not worry about it too much. Basically, this one tells us that this feature of language changes about once every 2,000 years. Okay, that's what the first line tells us. Second line is something not to worry about for the moment. So this p-value is a sort of conventional p-value that just basically says, what's the where in the distribution of outcomes of this model do the actual data fall? And in this case, it says it falls right in the in the main part of the distribution, so it's consistent with this model. In this part, when it says it's just in the tail. Okay, so there's some indication that maybe this very simple model works quite well for indefinite articles, but not so well for definite articles. And this thing here basically tells us the same thing. So this is something called over-dispersion, which is basically a measure of the variance in some quantity that you measure, and you expect this number to be close to 1. So again, for indefinite it kind of works, but it's further away from 1. the definite articles. So there's some evidence, very, very weak evidence, that this very, very simple, totally trivial model that makes no reference to evolution whatsoever could actually reasonably well describe changes in the indefinite article, and it's kind of borderline for definite articles. Okay. However, there's a problem here, and it's right in the title, is that this model completely ignores the fact that language is being used by people, okay, and is subject to these kind of evolutionary pressures that I talked about right at the start. And so this Poisson process, which is the simplest possible model of change that you can come up with mathematically, doesn't actually apply when you have a process that's generated by population. So I'm going to show this to you very shortly. So great, we can do this and we can show that, yeah, it seems to provide a reasonable description, but there's a problem here, because how on earth do you get that description coming out of people talking to each other? How on earth does this magnify and turn into this simple Poisson process? Okay, and actually it turns out that's quite hard to do. So let me show you this. So we're going to explore a very, very wide range of evolutionary forces and vary them. So we're going to put the speakers back in. We're going to allow us to manipulate things like the different relationship played by these different forms of selection, how that relates to drift. And we're going to explore this huge parameter space of evolutionary models and see if we can come up with something that ideally explains the historical data even better than the Poisson process did. Okay. So let me just introduce a couple of parameters. So we have this idea of the interactor selection, which is basically that not all speakers are equal. We're going to make them sort of equal, but the idea that we're going to put in is that if you talk to a lot of people, then the amount of weight you can give individually to each one is going to be smaller than if you only speak to a few people. This is again, there's no real kind of psychological basis for this, but it feels kind of natural that if you're someone who interacts quite widely with the speech community, then any one individual you're going to have to be paying less attention to than if you're someone who only talks to your neighbour or something like that. Okay, but this allows us just to find a way. It just creates a space of models that we can explore. And then replicated selection, a little bit easier to think of. We're just going to say that the incoming variant, so in each instance of change, we'll just say, well, for whatever reason, there's something going on here. Maybe there's some kind of reason about how your language is structured in your brain that is causing you to say, I now want to put an affix on this word instead of using a separate word. And that is kind of more pleasant for some reason, so we will just do that more, and that puts a replicator bias on the incoming variant. Okay. But this basically gives us a way, so we can vary the network structure, which gives us a way to explore lots of interaction selection possibilities, and we have this classical kind of fitness reproduction advantage to the incoming variant that we can explore as well. There's actually two more parameters that are hidden in here that may not be obvious, and one of them is the number of items in the store, like how much we can remember, and we don't know what a reasonable value for that is, so we better be able to explore that as well. And then there's how often people get a chance to update their stores. So if you take a sort of a child-based learning theory for language change, and say, well, actually you only get one chance in your entire life to decide which way I'm going to mark articles in this language. If you take a more sort of usage-based perspective, you might say, well, actually every utterance gives me an opportunity to change my behaviour in some way. So again, we've got a whole space to explore between these two possibilities as well. So this has just generated like a massive, massive, massive parameter space for us to explore. Okay, now I realise I'm running out of time. This bit's getting a bit technical, this next bit. So it turns out it's actually quite hard to analyse this model, to get predictions out of this model, because it's a very big and complicated model. We found an approximation to it, which I'm not going to explain in too much detail, but basically the idea is that at some point in time, people talking, like things are changing a little bit. At some point in time, there is a point at which the language will start to change to the next stage in the cycle. We call that origination, and then it gets to the end of that process when the next stage of the cycle is embedded, and that's called fixation. And it turns out that these two processes can be have different statistical distributions. So this one can be modelled as a Poisson process, but this one actually not. We call it a gamma process because it has a sort of independent mean and variance. I can talk more about this offline, but let me just show you the picture that it produces, and this is the important one. So we can simulate the model that I just showed you, the one with all the blobs and people talking to each other, and we can work out what's the probability after some time t that we've gone from one stage in the cycle to the next? And that is the blue dots here. We can approximate it with just a Poisson process, which is the simple dumb model that I just talked about, and it gives you the dotted line. And then we can do this fancier version, where we treat the origination and the fixation as two separate processes. And what we see is that there is a difference between the two models at what physicists would call early times. Okay? But linguistically, actually, it's late times, because this is measured in generations. So if a generation is like 25 years, then up to about the first sort of 20,000 years, there is a difference between the Poisson process and what the evolutionary model does. Okay? And as you can see, it's actually much less likely for a change to have happened when you think about the entire population, and the fact that, so basically what this is showing is that people are talking to each other, like something new happens, but then there's a process that has to kind of propagate through the speech community. So when you put that process in, that causes a deviation from the Poisson process, which is why we get nervous about just using a Poisson process to describe historical data, because, well, if you've got a speech community, everybody's got to be doing this for the language change to have occurred. So this propagation process, this fixation process is quite important. It needs to be in there, and it gives us a difference between the Poisson process and the non-Poisson process. Right, we will get there. So I'm going to now flash some graphs past you. Basically, right, this is the main one. Okay. So one of the hypotheses you could investigate is perhaps one that's sort of popularly talked about a lot in the literature, is that, like I just said, you have this sort of more child-based view where the job of the child for learning the language is to identify which of these four possibilities is in use. They see enough kind of instances of language use and they go, aha, English is a language which has a distinct word for definite article, and that's what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. And that corresponds to some combination of parameters. So let me try and explain these graphs to you. So the upper graph here is a measure of how much less likely the observed data are within the evolutionary model than in the Poisson process. Okay? And so this is what we call plausibility. So it's something called the Akaike information criterion, if people know about this sort of stuff. Basically, the way to interpret this is that if you want something that is at least as good as the Poisson process, this number needs to be smaller than 5. Okay? And ideally, you want it to be negative, which tells you that it's better than the Poisson process. We get numbers like 10,000, okay, within this model. The best you can do is if you turn the selection strength up to infinity, okay, and then you get numbers like 350 or 160, which are much bigger than 5. Okay, so that's something to take away from that. So what that's telling us is that we've got this we've got this Poisson process, which has no population underpinning it, provides quite a nice model for the data. We then compare, like, how much better is this evolutionary model, which has childhood language learning and all this kind of stuff going on, and we find that it's the way to interpret this is that it's like e to the minus 100 or e to the minus 300 times less plausible, less good description of the data. Okay, and you can do like a goodness of fit measure, and again, these numbers are supposed to be basically 1, and we get numbers like 30,000. So even if you were to accept, let's just choose the best within this evolutionary space, what you find is that it's actually a really, really bad model. Okay. So that's kind of confusing. Okay. So we can play with various things. I don't want to talk about these too much, apart from just to try and get to the bottom line. So we can play with interaction rates and how long people remember things for. And the story is basically that you can get much better descriptions if you're willing to allow people to be very forgetful, okay, and have memories which are of order of kind of minutes, or if you embed them in very heterogeneous social structures, okay, which is kind of the one that I prefer. So this kind of grey zone here is the zone where you get things which look more like the Poisson process, and you find that if we combine these two effects, allow people to be a bit forgetful, put them in heterogeneous societies, then you find that you can get things where the plausibility and also the goodness of fit is much more reassuring. So why? Okay. So the reason is basically if an individual speaker can change their behaviour reasonably quickly, then because you need a whole population of speakers for the language to change, okay, to change their behaviour. So for the whole population to change, even on a 2,000-year time scale, actually requires the individuals to change, relatively quickly. Okay. And why does heterogeneity help? So the reason why heterogeneity helps is that, certainly within the model that we've used, and you can think, the various mechanisms that might work for this, is that if there are certain individuals who manage to have a much bigger impact on the linguistic behaviour of the population through their prestige bias or through just the fact that they talk to more people or whatever it is, then you end up, essentially, you can identify two groups of people. You can identify a core group of people who essentially have the power to change the language, and then a peripheral group who don't. Okay, and if that core group, and in these network models, what you find is that the core group varies quite weakly depending on with the total population size. The big problem with these models is that we're dealing with quite different population sizes. Some of these changes happen in small populations, some of them happen in large populations, and when you just take a first look at the data, they basically seem to be telling you that the size of the population is essentially irrelevant to the pace of changes. It's once every 2,000 years pretty much in every population, no matter how big it is. Okay. Unfortunately, all these evolutionary models say there should be a really big effect of population size, and that's why we get these crazy numbers. Okay. And one of the ways to deal with that dependence on population size is if you have complex societies that are arranged sort of quite heterogeneously, which then means that the number of people who are able to affect the language is much smaller and varies weakly with the population size compared to the true number. So there we go. I realise that went a bit fast, but let me try and summarise. It was actually sort of two talks packaged together into one, unwisely. Let me just try and summarise what I've said. So right at the start, I talked about evolutionary forces in both a biological and a cultural evolutionary context, and you find that sort of verbally you can describe things in the same way. And the nice thing is that actually mathematically we can describe these things in the same way as well. So after the initial disappointment that Fisher and Wright got there 80 years before we did, this has actually allowed some quite productive investigations going on from there. One of the things that is equally annoying if you're both a biological evolutionist and a cultural evolutionist is that there's this very, very simple evolutionary mechanism called drift, which is just random sampling iterated over many interactions and many speakers. And this serves, at a qualitative level, it can give you a lot of the qualitative phenomenology, it can cause things to change, it can give you skewed frequency distributions, it can give you all sorts of things. Sometimes it even works quantitatively. Occasionally you go, aha, it's failed, we can now go on to a more interesting model, and then someone comes up with another data set which says, well, actually, maybe drift is kind of working. So this is an ongoing conversation. It's been ongoing actually in biology, I think basically since population genetics was founded, and depending on who you talk to, they say, no, selection, it really is kind of dominating everything, or they say, well, actually, it's complicated, and it seems to be just as complicated in language. And then the last part, so to kind of hark back to Darwin, I should have emphasised this more as I was going through, but I just kind of said it. So the curious thing about this historical survey that we've just done is that what we found is that what was already well established and very well known was that in any of these evolutionary models, when you have a population that's there, the size of the population matters because it affects both the rate at which these originations can happen and it affects the time it takes for the change to go through. And we're dealing with a wide range of populations, from thousands of speakers up to tens of millions of speakers. And what we find is that to the best, it's a small data set, but to the best that we can interpret it, that there's very little evidence within the data set that population size has any effect on the rate of language change. Okay, and so this is a problem for the models because the models say it's really central. Okay, and so there are ways of getting around it, and the ways that seem to work, I think, most plausibly, is by having this variation in social status, by basically saying that some people are just much more important than others when it comes to changing language, which could be through the way that the social network is arranged. It could be through kind of awareness of how different groups in your society behave, and and people somehow cooperatively, preferentially replicating certain individuals in the society, or there could be some other mechanism that's out there that we haven't thought of. But I think, well, what we really need is more data, of course. What we really need is more data, more cross-linguistic historical data to really investigate this question of, does population size matter? There's been one other study of this in PNAS where they find very weak dependence, like small power law dependence, which is exactly what comes out of these social network models. So it's insensitive. It's not completely absent, but there could be a very weak dependence, but it's much weaker than would be explained by most evolutionary theories. And I think the way that you might get out of this is by basically breaking this sort of the assumed equivalence between all people. We're not all equal when it comes to language change. Anyway, so I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
Question.
I have one little question.
Yeah.
You at some point you mentioned the number of generations needed to make the change, and I don't know how you relate generations to the number of iterations of the translation.
Right, yes, good question. So what is a generation? So a generation, it's basically a generation is the time that it takes, let's get this right, I think for each of your memories to have had an opportunity to have been replaced. Okay, so it's really a question. So in this sense, it's so if you take the most easy to talk about model, which is the one where you just say, I have one slot in my memory to decide whether I use the or this or whatever it is, and I get one chance in my life to set that parameter as to how I'm going to use the language, then a generation is the human generation, 25 years. Okay. On the other hand, if you're saying, well, actually, no, I keep lots and lots of memories in my head, and these can be updated incrementally every little time that I speak, then a generation is actually quite a different time. So it could be like 5 years or something, or it could be 30 minutes, depending on what you think that should be. And that's essentially what we use as a free parameter, because we don't know what it's supposed to be, so we kind of explore the space. But what we find is if you make the generation time small, then you get something that better reproduces the historical data. Okay, so you could possibly use that as evidence kind of against the child-based theory more in terms of the usage-based theory, or you might choose not to do that. He said, sitting on the fence.
Thanks very much. It's super interesting. I can think of two parameters that, well, I guess would make your model even more complicated.
Yeah.
So one would be the decay rate of how forgetful people are. I think we have reasonably good evidence to say that different phenomena in language have actually different decay rates.
They do.
So semantic priming is something that goes away in split seconds, but syntactic priming is something that can persist for hours and days even. So yeah, I'm not quite sure how to implement that.
No, me neither. But I think, so I presented this to my colleagues linguistic colleagues in Edinburgh who also been doing some work on priming. And when I started talking about minutes and hours, they went, yeah, that sounds fine from a kind of priming perspective.
Structural priming, minutes and hours are completely fine, yeah.
So, so this is the thing. And also, I mean, there's other effects like, well, you'll know much better than me, so I am busking here, but things like, peak end rules and stuff like that, not every token would be the same. So there might be, there's a working memory, if you like, which is the relevant thing and not your long-term. I can see there'd be a whole bunch of things that it's very hard to interpret these numbers and whether the exponential model is any good. There's a whole load of things for us to think about. But what I would take away from what we've done is that we need to think about those things, right? It turns out to be actually quite crucial, and it relates to your question that, there is a generation time in these kind of evolutionary processes, and it's going to be related to memory storage and recall and usage in some way that we currently don't understand. And it turns out we do need to understand it in order to make sense of the historical timescales.
Yeah, and my second point, so currently the speakers in your model are monolinguals, right?
Yeah.
And we know that bilingualism has actually quite an important role to play in language change, and also in the relative stability of languages and the relative propensity to change. So could it be that
all of this is epiphenomenal.
that population size might actually interact with bilingualism in interesting ways, so that the bigger the population size, the greater the likelihood that there will be contact with other languages, and the greater the likelihood that there will be contact-induced change.
Yeah, that is very interesting. Actually. So what you're saying is that so the largeness gives us a reason why the dynamics might be different, and therefore
in the real world at least. I mean, in silico you can have a big population with just one language.
Sure. Yes, we haven't really thought about bilingualism in this context. The one thing that I can say is that one of the things that we looked at, so this over-dispersion that I talked about, one of the things that can also be interpreted as is the number of correlated data points. Okay, so if you get 1, then it's basically saying that each sample is independent. Then somewhere like 2.7 says that, well, maybe languages are kind of correlated roughly in pairs. And an obvious explanation for that would be contact between languages. Right? We've got a bunch of Indo-European languages in there, so the fact that German changed and English changed is, kind of maybe not a huge coincidence, and that could have been mediated by contact. But both of those signals are quite weak. So it's saying that if contact's doing something, it's not doing very much, at least from that perspective. But I like your point about the fact that it could help us with the with this thing, the fact that the population size somehow gets screened out somehow, that becomes a much less relevant variable. And you're right, like in the model we just kind of don't have anything, we only model one population at a time, so we haven't put in any mechanism for contact. Good point.
A key element is the access to data, so apparently you collected a nice database, icon database. What do you think is the perspective for having good diacritic data?
I think that question is actually best put to a linguist at some level, because it depends on the kind of thing that you want to explain. So I guess if you're wanting to talk about, say, lexical replacement, something like that, then presumably things like, these online, Twitter and stuff would be perfectly fine for that. But if you're wanting to talk about grammatical change, then because we've got this problem that it happens once every 2,000 years, well, at least for this feature, I don't know about other features, but at least for this feature, this could be a lot harder. But I think one can look at a more fine-grained level. So I think, so currently I'm working with a corpus linguist, Rob Troswell, and he's got, sort of texts through English going back sort of several hundred years, and he's interested in determiners, things like that. So various bits of things that have some grammatical function that he explains to me, and it stays in my head for about a picosecond what it means, and then it just kind of disappears again, unfortunately. But anyway, the point is that we have seen we've identified a bunch of forms and functions where at some point in the history of these texts, every form has been used for each of the functions. So there's been a kind of a complete exploration of the kind of form and function space of this relatively limited set of form and functions. So we're hoping that we can extract some interesting information out of that. So it may be that whatever we've got lying around in things like Fantext and other corpora, there's enough sort of things going on in there for us to be able to explore. What both this and the Ahern study showed is that actually putting in a little bit of time seems to actually buy you a lot in terms of inferential power. Just looking at one point in time doesn't seem to, because basically, you can come up, and as physicists we understand this, we can come up with a wide range of models that can predict a distribution, a stationary distribution. There are many different processes that can give you the same stationary distribution, for example. However, if you're looking at changes from one time point to another, then that immediately restricts your space of models quite powerfully. And so Anne Candler, who's at the MPI somewhere in Dresden, she has done some theoretical work looking at basically how much inferential power having some historical data buys you, and the answer is a lot, kind of in some mathematically precise sense. Yeah. So I think so basically taking what you've got and just trying to find I think for me, what you want to do is you want to find an interesting linguistic question, and then amass as much data as you can. But there may be enough, but like I said, there may be enough in these text-based corpora to be getting along with, which would be, I think, of great reassurance to a lot of us. Yeah.
It's not you completely clear. You want, some of the changes you talk were more grammatical, and some were more lexical, right? Yeah. And your assumption is that the same model could explain the same kind of changes, because I don't really know language, but it seems to me that in one case you have be most of the time one rule that prevails, whereas in the other case you might have a lot of diversity in the...
No, you're right. No, I agree that there were going to be...
And another point, just,
yeah.
And the role of social status is different, because if I think about grammar, for me the reference is the school teacher I already had 30 years ago, you know, and she's the one that whereas for the the word I'm using in my vocabulary, I can introduce some novelty even today, you know.
Yeah, I think it's probably unlikely that you learn the grammar of your own language from your teacher.
Of course, but partly, we start school at 3.
Yeah, yeah, because you're so hardcore. Right, okay. So what was the first point again? Remind me. Oh, the different. Yeah, okay. One size fits all model. Okay, so this is where this is okay. So you've spotted the physicist in the room. That yes, this is, I'm afraid, guilty as charged. That we tend to look for single common explanations where they don't exist. So yeah, no, fine. I take that on the chin. Now, I know, again, I think this does, however, there are probably people in the room who are better placed to field that question than me, but no, and I think there are some theories that more or less just say, well, actually, between kind of words and grammars, they can be viewed theoretically in the same framework. Other people, say that they're different. Certainly, timescales are different, and I think that's uncontroversial. That grammar changes more slowly than the word for sofa. I think that no one would argue with that. And in fact, we've seen that because one happened over 50 years and others will take 2,000 years. So we do know that, and that's presumably because the one is more of a systemic thing. That you have to change a whole system rather than just changing one component of that system. Yeah. So there's a fairly obvious explanation for why those would happen on different time scales. Relating to your point on social status, so here, yeah, I'm using that term very, very flexibly to include, and so really all I mean by it here is the fact that in terms of a language change happening, it might be that there's a small group of people who are responsible for that. Now, it doesn't mean that the mechanism is the same for lexical items and grammar. They could come through completely different mechanisms. Okay, but I'm just looking for ways to explain the weekend effect, basically, and that seems to be just one way to do it. Okay. Good. Yeah.
Yes, just about the evolution of sofa versus couch, etc. When you see the evolution of couch, it seems that there is a conformism effect because these kind of sigmoids curves, they often happen in diffusion of innovation when there is some kind of conformism in a part of the population. Did you think or did you try to test the hypothesis of your model where you add some kind of conformism?
So conformity is what a...
it's like some of the agents tend to adopt the behavior of the majority.
Right.
Instead of just random drawing, some of them just copy the majority all around them. And this creates this kind of sigmoids often. Yeah,
so we have, I guess that is of the majority, right. So I think you had that in your model as sort of, because your curve of, did you not have that?
I didn't.
Okay, so just basically a bias towards the more frequent item in the population. I thought you had that. Anyway,
but this is here indirectly by just the imitation.
Yeah, no, but you can add more of that. The effect of that is that yes, you can. So you can put that in, but the problem is that if you have a conformity bias, then it makes, when something is new, when something is innovated, it is by definition in the minority. So it's actually biased against to begin with. So you give it a much harder hill to climb than if you do things uniformly. And so what that tends to do is that tends to make it greatly extend the time between innovations actually propagating. So we did look at it briefly, and we didn't kind of discuss it much further than that because we found that it made things very hard to propagate. So there's probably a more sophisticated. So in this diffusion of innovation story, there's this characterization of different parts of your population as the innovators and the early majority and stuff like that. And you probably need to put into this sort of people's attitudes towards innovation. So some people might generally be pro-innovation, okay, which could then reversely, you might have some people who are conformists and they kind of have to win each other over. So I think if you have that, it's a more complicated story than just saying we favour the thing that's in the majority, because then that means the minority. It makes it very hard for things to get off the ground.
Okay, thank you again.
Okay.